Listeners, welcome. Give me 3 or 4 words that describe your authentic self. Come on in and let's talk about it. Listeners, I am so excited. Today we have Ep3 Douglas and Miss Amy Danielson. So I'm going to throw it over to you two to introduce yourselves and answer the question. Like, what are some words that describe who you think your authentic self is?
Awesome. Thank you, Jody. My name is Ep3 Douglas. I am a strategist at a local agency. I am a wedding planner alongside my sister, and I'm also a wife and a mom to a 1-year-old. And I have known Jody for most of my life, but in the last 10 years or so, we've been able to partner more in a professional capacity, which has been really fun. Yeah. And that's really led to the conversation we're going to have today.
What are words that describe you for your authentic self?
I would say my authentic self. I am curious. I would say calm and collected. I get told a decent amount. And adaptable. I have a strength in reading a room, figuring out how I need to show up, how I want to show up, and just kind of steadily flowing. Amy always jokes, sometimes we'll be on a call and she'll be like, I did not know that person. Like, I just turned on whatever I needed to turn on. So adaptable would be the last word I would use to describe my authentic self.
And my name is Amy. I am a NICU nurse. I'm also a wedding planner with my sister and currently pursuing my doctorate in nurse midwifery. Alongside that, I am a wife and a mom to 15-month-old twins. I like to wear a lot of hats, and that kind of flows into the words I would use to describe myself, would be strong-willed, multifaceted, and driven.
I'm so excited to have you both here. And listeners, as they said, they are indeed sisters. So there'll be some bantering and maybe even hitting each other a little bit. Depends how it goes. I asked this question about our authentic selves because, as we know, we grow up in this societal system that normalizes one identity over another. And the societal system, we know this through research, sends more asset-based, more positive message, statistically more often or more frequently, to a normalized dominant identity. And an identity that's not normalized dominant, it doesn't mean they never hear anything positive, but statistically speaking, will hear more deficit or negative descriptors at a higher rate. And so you and I, we all live in this societal system where our identities, whether it's our age or our race or our gender, our identities are being sent messages. So if we're going to figure out, like, what is my authentic self, we have to start to process that. We have to become aware of what are our identities, and then hold up, what messages have I got because of those identities, and and how have I responded to those messages? Sometimes we've internalized those messages and they have us acting a certain way. And that's not really our authentic self. If we step back and realize, wait a second, I'm doing that because I grew up in a societal system that sent me those messages, we can start to reanalyze if that's how we really want to maneuver and operate in the world. The other thing we want to look at is not just the messages that have been sent to us about our identities, but the messages that the societal system sends us about all identities. Because the identities that we don't hold, we've been hearing messages about that identity, and so then we have perceptions about that identity that oftentimes isn't true, but then we may come into a room and we might be working on ourselves and showing up with more authenticity, but what we end up doing is putting the societal system's perception on another person, which kind of smothers them and doesn't allow them to show up with their authentic self. And so Amy and Ep3, I've known them both since they were young, and it's been fun to watch them grow up and then be able to work with them professionally and see them, become parents. And they've been actively working on their journey of awareness. And so I thought, oh my gosh, if we're going to talk about authentic self, to bring these two in and have them start to process some of the things that they learned about the messages that were sent to them about their identities, and also the perceptions that are sometimes put on them, so that they can figure out who they are. I've seen them grow into more and more every day, grow into who you are and operate out of your authentic self. So for you guys, where do you want to start?
Yeah. I love what you're talking about with growing into your authentic self, because I think that's exactly what it is. I think that growing up, my priorities when I showed up in a space were different.
Absolutely. And when you guys we were prepping and they're like, well, my authentic self is this and it's this. And they're so absolute and I'm dying laughing. I'm like, okay, yes. Well, give it 30 years and your authentic self will be different. So thank you for mentioning that because I think that's important for us to hear that this is continuous. My authentic self, I think I knew my authentic self, in my 20s, but as I have time and more experiences and more time to process, it's like, oh, wait a minute, I have another deeper awareness of authentic self. And so we're all on that journey. I like that you emphasize that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because part of that awareness is being able to identify it. And Amy and I always joke, I feel like I always become friends with her friends, and it's 100% because I, in forming friendships at a young age, was always sort of reading the room and figuring out, okay, like what type of person do I need to be to get this person to like me? And I was always just trying to morph into this person that I thought people would want to be friends with. But Amy never did that. She's always been just so authentic and so true to herself, she has so many people that I like being around because then I, by default, am also able to be myself. And so it's interesting now having that level of awareness and just seeing how it manifests in our lives. It's been honestly really fun.
Yeah. And I think it goes back to a young age, like the interpersonal conflicts that were had at a young age. I think I realized early that like I just needed to be who I was because the chameleon act wasn't working for me. So I think that awareness too of who I am and the people who come to me are going to end up being the people who are for me, versus I think we've had different experiences and it's been at different stages of life where we've come into that awareness.
Mm-hmm. Fully. I feel like at this point in my life now I can show up with whether it's friends or meeting anyone in any context, and I know how I want to be, or I'm not feeling like I need to chameleon or morph. But
so that's so interesting. So what are some of the messages? Because if I'm hearing you right, you used to read a room and then adjust accordingly, which is a skill set, and but you didn't have your authentic self first. So I can still read a room and adjust myself, but without losing my authentic self. But you hadn't discovered your authentic self at that time. You're talking when you're young. So what are for both of you, what are some of the messages the identities you hold that you received messages about those identities that you had to process to figure out who was your authentic self, or the perceptions that others had that were put on you, so that you could start to identify those and then process them to get to your authentic self? Are there examples that you have?
Mm-hmm. I think a big one for me when it comes to context outside of my friends, I would say I have had to navigate perceptions being Black, being a woman, and being a naturally passionate or animated person. At my baseline, like my authentic self is very bubbly. Like I'm very I say exactly how I'm feeling, and I'm very excited as I say it. And in some contexts, that has been misconstrued. That has been taken as if we're having a passionate debate, that I have an attitude or that I'm angry. Or it has been taken as, like, I think people are just like caught off guard at the combination of this like level of passion and the way I present myself. And it has been tough to navigate because that is so core to who I am, but it doesn't always serve me. So there have been so many situations where I now hold my true self closer to my chest because I'm constantly balancing how is this going to be perceived in the situation. Like I feel one thing, but you won't be able to tell on the outside because I'm trying to not be misperceived.
And almost like be more palatable.
Yeah. Like it's this constant, I can tell from people's reactions in certain settings, and less so now, but this has been a journey. But I can tell when it's not landing the way I mean it to.
Yeah, and if I'm hearing you right, one is being a woman, and I think our women listeners can relate to this. That if women come out with a lot of passion, that sometimes then that gets perceived as, the B word, or I'll use bossy. There's another B word you can put in there. Where I've seen our male colleagues be equally as passionate, and it's actually almost applauded, like, oh, he's driven, oh, he's powerful, more asset based again. And then am I hitting it with the women piece?
Yeah. I think the woman piece is so complicated because it's exactly right. Depending on the context, it can be misconstrued. In some contexts, it's completely fine for a woman to be passionate, for me, it's always like, yeah, what do you want to get out of the situation? How do you need other people to receive you? And then, yes, exactly.
And then the other layer of being a Black woman, that sometimes the perception in the societal system is, I always hear the angry Black woman, or that they're going to take control, or again, be bossy. And so those messages, so then when you're showing up with what is your authentic self and that passion, it's not maybe getting perceived with the positivity, but more with the deficit. And because of that, you've learned to have to navigate. Is that what I'm hearing? Mm-hmm. Yeah. How about for you, Amy?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I go back to when I graduated college and became a nurse. It's funny because I wanted my hair to be braided for the interview process, and I was very cognizant of that fact. But then I immediately wore my natural hair when I started my job, which I had done maybe once in my life for like a very brief period. So it wasn't really my authentic self, but I wanted these new people who had never met me to see me almost at my rawest form, so that if they accepted me then, they would accept me when I was doing the things that society had told me for all these years to do. So I always think back on that because I don't even think I was very aware, or I wasn't stepping into my authentic self because I knew how to be palatable in order to get the position. But then there's a part of me who knew I wanted these people to accept me if I decided to, adventure into what I felt most comfortable in. So that's one I just know that if I show up in a space more palatable to start, I'm going to be more fearful to reveal parts of myself. So I always think back on that time as...
So in that moment, you wanted to, when you started that new job, start with more of your authentic self up front.
Yeah, and
right?
It's like I struggle to say authentic self because it's like wearing my hair natural isn't my authentic self, but it's something I've always been fearful of doing because I didn't know how it would be received. So it's almost like if they'll accept me at that, then I know
they'll accept you. Yeah, and for listeners, because for some of us this isn't our experience, but if we remember the triangle chart, page 34, 35, we normalize the European heritage and ethnicity. And with that comes normalizing and more asset-based and positive messages towards European type of hair. And so I just remember years, not that long ago, Googling unprofessional hair, and that's when you would see black hair that was done like cornrows and I was just going, are you kidding? How much time is that? It's beautiful. But the perception is, again, that less than. And so the messages, and so it's interesting you said that even wearing your hair natural isn't always your authentic self. And one might argue, but that is authentically who you are. But the societal system sends such strong messages that is not acceptable. So you choosing to start there when you went to that job so that they could accept all of you or who you are, and then you can go back. Yeah. That's interesting.
It's almost like it was one of those things I knew I would want to explore, but I wanted to know if I didn't like it, it wasn't for fear of not being accepted, if that makes sense. I wanted to know that I could do it And if I chose not to, it was because it wasn't my authentic self, versus for all those years growing up, it was always something I wanted to dabble in, but never did because I was fearful of how it would be received. So, I mean, the message sent to me growing up was that the straighter my hair was, the longer my hair was, the more compliant my hair was how I should walk around the world. So kind of going against that message at a later age in life was, it takes practice, and yeah.
I feel like that's so much of this conversation. It comes back to, in any given situation, if you decide to do the thing that society expects you to do, or if you don't, it's like, at this age, you want to make sure it's because it's what you want to do and not because of that. Mm-hmm. I think that that's the biggest change in the journey and in like growing your level of awareness. It's the confidence in being like, when you're younger, to your point, like you're doing things for whatever reason it may be, but a lot of times it is because of the messages you're receiving, and it is because of what you hope to get out of forming into this person. But as you get older, you're able to be like, okay, I'm actually going to make this decision. And I like the way you describe it, because it's like, I might not want to wear my hair natural, but I want it to be because of me. And I feel myself doing that all the time, where it's like, yeah, I might not want to do this thing I've always done, or I might not want to do this new thing because of my own.
And it's like always the pivots in life where you get to try something new out. Mm-hmm. Like I was recently talking about like our names. Mm-hmm. I go by Amy. It's spelled E-M-E-E. And it's been since we were super young that we had these names that people could pronounce. And I'm like, I'm going to graduate soon. I'm going to have a new job. If I want to go by M.M., that's my opportunity to try out that, like, is that my authentic self? Versus if I just showed up to work today and I'm like, call me M.M., like it just... I know that people are going to be like, but you're Amy. Like, you've always been Amy to us. So I think those pivots in life are times that we're able to then try on almost like these new versions of ourselves that might actually be our authentic selves that we've had to mute for so many years.
Yeah, and that, I think, for me, with both of your names, goes back again to that European ethnicity, taking names that have a very strong from Nigeria and making them much more European in enunciation, and then you guys have a journey. Like, is my authentic self the name as it was originally to be spoken? Is it what I've used all these years? And that's not for me to decide. That's your journey, right? So listeners, we always have to, when we look at somebody, we're like, oh, they're not operating out of their authentic self. Well, we don't know. You know what I mean? Like, we don't know. On that journey, I hear you guys are actively thinking about, okay, is this who I am, or is this a result of those messages? Are there other messages growing up that you guys had to become aware of and then had to start to process, like, okay, am I that message or am I this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the main things growing up in a predominantly white area was we always got good grades, and, when we were speaking to adults, we were told that we were so well spoken, or, we were complimented on just being smart or doing the things that almost should have been expected of anyone. But since we were Black, it almost caught people off guard. And so then we were complimented, whereas another kid, it would have just been what was expected of them. And I think I've carried that one with me because I do value being educated. I do value pursuing those opportunities, but I've also been told for all these years that that was so good and that people were surprised by that. So I think as I pursue my education in midwifery, I could become a midwife many, many ways, some including not getting a doctorate. I could have gotten a master's, or I could have gotten a certification. But for me, I now strive and almost overcorrect, and I shoot for the absolute top of whatever I'm pursuing, because I don't want there to be like a shadow of doubt or, hesitation in anyone else's mind. I want to make sure that I am the best. And I think I've really dove headfirst into that message that I've been sent. And so it's like, do I value getting the highest education, or am I overcompensating and trying to continue to impress?
And I think that right there is why finding our authentic self is a lifelong journey, because I've known you always to be driven, and so right now I hear your answer is, hey, I want this. I want to be a doctor, and have that doctorate degree because I'm a driven person and that's who I am. But you also are naming and aware of it might be also because I'm overcompensating because people don't expect that of me. Yeah. And that messages of surprise, the perceptions then that we hold, we want to be aware of, because what I'm hearing you say is people weren't aware of their perception. So the minute you spoke formal and you were getting good grades and achieving at school, people always highlighted that with you. Whereas if another white student came along, maybe that would just be the expectation, so they wouldn't go out of their way to highlight it. And that's more than in the eyes of the person with that perception. And so for me, that's why we got to do the work on both sides, is what messages have we been sent about our own identities, and are we overcompensating or under, and then what messages have we been sent about identities we don't hold that affect how we talk to folks, and when we compliment them, for example, about their hair or about their grades. Yeah, that's a really good one. And I like, again, I want to emphasize to listeners, it's a lifelong, and to check in, like when you're listening to stories like Amy just shared, what are your thoughts? Are you like, oh, girl, she's not acting out of her authentic self, she should, or, oh yeah, she's doing it, way to go. What are our thoughts? Because when we listen to people's journey about processing this, we're oftentimes think we know where they should be. And are we just holding a space to allow that person to be where they're at? Like I look forward to continuing to talk to you in the years to come, if we're blessed enough to do that, as to, oh, Jody, you know what? I think I was overcompensating. Or Jody, I don't think I was at all. This is just who I am. You know what I mean? But it's an ongoing journey. And we all have to take our own steps. But for you, Heidi, were there messages that you've had to process or perceptions you've had to process?
I feel like there are so many deeper ones that we can describe, but this also makes me think, when I first moved to Minneapolis after graduating, I didn't have a car for 4 years, and it was a lifestyle choice. I just didn't want to. I could walk to my job. Back then, if I was socializing, a lot of times I was Ubering, or there were just so many other ways to get around. So I just didn't have a car. But the way that people thought that I didn't have a car because I couldn't afford it, and the number of times people would be like, oh, I'm going to buy a new car. You can buy my car if you...
Oh, funny.
And I found myself having to over-justify my decision to not have a car. And I was like, the U.S. is predominantly auto-centric communities, but that's not the case everywhere in the world. This is it. I was like, it's not that weird. And I could buy, and it's all things that are weird to say in a sense. I could buy a car, I'm just not choosing to. The number of times I caught myself having to explain, I could afford a car, but I just don't want one. And it always comes to mind for me, because it's kind of like what you were describing. Sometimes it's you understand the situation that's happening, and then you have to find the right way for the way that you're showing up to land.
And I feel like there's a theme of doubling down, because you only just recently got a car, and it's well, now I have a kid, and he goes to daycare. You almost had to have then so many reasons to go into what people expected of you.
So people don't think I was just giving in.
Yeah. So there's many situations like that where...
Well, and operating our authentic self is hard, especially when it's counter to the normalized dominant. And so the normalized dominant identities we talk about in the book, I think when I'm hearing you is, do you think your identities of being younger and a woman and Black went into why people were always offering their car, or in assuming that it was financial as to why you didn't have it?
It had to have been.
Yeah.
Especially because in the context, working downtown, so many people don't drive in.
Right.
Regardless of your role in a company, regardless of anything,
yeah.
it had to have been.
But I think even talking back then, you would be on the bus and there would be like men in their suits. And I think you had this hyper fixation on how, like, what you wore to work too, because how you present yourself, even on the bus.
It's like, I'm also going to
yeah,
my
like
office
you,
job.
then when you were getting dressed to go to work, you wanted people on that bus to know.
I don't need the bus financially.
Yeah.
Exactly. I'm on the
choosing
bus
this.
because I choose this
yeah,
lifestyle, but I am going to my job that is X, Y, and
Yes.
Z.
Completely.
Whether it's subconscious or conscious, it's always present in the back of your mind.
Because I want to point out too, for us and listeners, is our societal system, we normalize these identities and the societal system gears towards it, but the societal system also has normal ways of operation. And as you said, in America, the normal way of operation, normalized dominant, is automobiles. We are very relied on them. Capitalism is a normalized dominant, way of, when people want to pull out of those, it's interesting to see how other folks respond. And that's, I think, when a lot of times our identities come into play. Like, you can't just pull out of it. It must be because you financially can't afford that. And it's like, so it's hard to pull out of normalized dominant modes of operation, no matter who you are. But I think that's also when identities come up as to why people think you're pulling out, is because of the perception they have of your identities. And then what happens, like I hear you're saying, is we start to overcompensate. Well, am I going to get on the bus? I'm going to look good, right? And that then we always have to start talking about, okay, is that me operating on my authentic self? And of course, we can't always operate out of our authentic self. So am I making that choice? Like, no, I am a little overcompensating, but I feel I need to in this spot, and here's why. And so I think for listeners, it's equally important as we discover who our authentic self is to know, I don't know that we can operate out of it 24/7, right? And there are times but are we consciously making that choice? Like, in this situation, I know I might have these perceptions put on me, so I'm going to adjust here because I just don't want to deal with it, right? And I think that's fine. I mean, that's how we maneuver through life. But the more we can be conscious, then that allows us to know just how often or frequently we're not operating out of our authentic self. It's like, wait a second, now I have had to adjust 4 times. You know what? I got to go back to just being who I am, and letting things fall where they will.
Yeah.
Awesome. And I love what you were saying about needing to adjust or doing something and then kind of going back to your authentic self. I think we talk a lot about when we were growing up, and like, our arms were always muscular. And at a young age, I always wore long sleeves even if it was summer. Like, I feel like, or doing little things, like we talk about, like picking up your backpack in class, like where your arm would like flex, and little things like that for both of us have just always, like, it was a thing in our life, like a very visceral. Our peers perceived our strength as just being, I guess, weird for the age, but we didn't think it was weird. Like, I liked being strong. And that's been something that has evolved throughout our whole life, where now it's like, of course you want to have strong arms. And like, we love that in pictures, or like we love like lifting and all of those things. But that has, like, our strength, or the way that was perceived, especially probably as women, has always been something that it was very obvious that the ways that we were adjusting were for other people. And like, we would just keep adjusting and keep wearing long sleeves in summer and keep like avoiding doing these things. And then just eventually we were able to get to the point where it's like, that's not serving us and that's not who we are.
Kind of that reclaiming,
yes,
right?
Completely.
Because the societal system messages, I think, are very strong about, males are strong and females are weaker, or, and just, it's not normalized, like, to have defined arms as a male. I mean, that's always seems to be celebrated, but defined arms as a female, especially when you were younger, as you said, your classmates pointed that out to the degree you covered it up. And now I know you two. The minute it gets warm, they're like, right? You're flexing. I love it. But taking that piece back, like, this is who I am.
And there were, like, even beyond being weak, it was like you wanted to be like dainty, like you wanted to be the girl that the boys liked. And that was something that if someone made a comment based on your arms, like I wasn't so much concerned even with being perceived as weak from the society expectation, but more so like I wanted to be liked. I didn't want to be bigger than, the boys my age. So
well, and I like what you just said with dainty, like why, and this gets into that our societal system often sends us those either or messages, either you're dainty or you're not. Well, how about we change the definition of dainty? You know what I mean? How about we look at why can't you have very well defined arms and still be very feminine or very dainty? How about we expand it? And so I think for me, figuring out my authentic self, sometimes I was like, I'm not going to use those words, but then I'm like, wait a minute, I'm going to use those words. I can be dainty, even looking, having broad shoulders and muscles. I can, that is what I feel like, and I can be those. So sometimes redefining or expanding our definitions, having that both and.
Yeah.
I can both have arms and be very feminine. I can both. So getting out of that either or thinking. Yeah.
I like the word feminine too, because I think growing up, when it came to being a woman, it was so closely tied with being feminine. So even little things like I don't wear makeup ever, and I would always like want to wear makeup because it's what everyone else was doing, and I knew it was what was expected of girls. And now it's like I consider myself very feminine, and I no longer hold makeup as being like one of the defining factors.
Right.
So
and so as we're on this journey, how the societal system defined feminine and how you're going to define it, two different things, and it's both and that allows you to still say, I am very feminine. Yeah, but my definition of feminine looks different, right?
Yeah. And on the topic of femininity, I feel like it ties so closely with emotions, and that's one thing I'm trying to reconnect with when it comes to my authentic self, because I was told from a very early age that my emotions and how quickly I was moved to tears, for better or for worse, was a problem. I just remember my second grade teacher calling my mom and being like, this girl cries a lot, like every day. And I just was constantly told that I needed to tone that side of myself down. And that's one thing that I kind of mourn having given up for other people's sake and to make other people comfortable. And so I think in finding my authentic self and connecting with my authentic self, just that ability to be emotional and to be vulnerable with others is something that I have to actively work to reclaim.
And that's so complicated, I feel like, because when you're talking about emotion, when you're talking about being a woman, when you're talking about being Black, like all of those intersects with emotion are so just like ripe with so much. And like when you break it apart, it's just like now at this point in your life, like even just thinking about being Black and being emotional, like the implications of that, thinking, I mean, you know this more than I do, but it's like the implications in the healthcare field, for example, where Black women are not trusted when we say we're in pain. And it's because society thinks that we should be able to handle more pain. And it's like, and so then you either are having to deal with, okay, maybe I'm being dramatic, like maybe it actually is fine, or you're like, no, like I know myself and I know like I think what you're describing is really important, because the ways that it manifests, if it isn't something that you do work on, become literally dangerous. Like it's
the perceptions, the messages about the identities that we all have experienced in the societal system can affect our perception of ourselves and of others. And then if I'm receiving these messages that Black women are stronger and don't feel pain, not directly, but indirectly or even directly, then that becomes my perception, and then that becomes my truth and my experience. So when I walk into the room, I don't even know that I am not taking your statement as serious as another person's statement. And go back to physical body. So if you're in the room and I come in as the doctor and you have arms that are very fit, very fit, like I'm thinking, oh, this is a strong, Black woman. And so then if you say you're in pain, I'm like, oh, must not be that, you know what I mean? So all of that, like you said, comes into play. But this is one of the reasons we want to figure out, okay, what are these messages we're sent? How have they affected us? And then how have they affected my perception about myself, so that I can start to pull apart what is my authentic self. But then as we do that, like you guys mentioned before, that allows us to open up a space to start to hold a bigger definition of identities we don't hold, and to relook at the perceptions we have of those identities, so that we can truly hear each other. Because like you said, in the health field, we have the research that if a black or brown, especially women, say they're in pain, is not acted on or heard as when a white woman says it. So.
Yeah, and I think we live in a super cool time, because I hold being strong as a big part of my identity, but we're moving into this time where, you know, we're hearing people say, like, use your joy and use your softness as an act of resistance. So we're able to be our authentic selves, and it's the both and. Like, I can be emotional, I can be vulnerable, and I can also be a strong Black woman without that having negative connotations. So, like, the more aware we become of ourselves and how multifaceted we are, it also helps us to reflect on the urgency to give other people that grace as well, because we grew up being told things about people who look like us, and it manifests in when we go out into the world and when we see people who look like us. What is our first, one picture phenomenon? And if we want people to look at us and give us grace and understand that there's more to us than what they see, we also have to reflect that on our experiences with other people in the world.
And it's not easy. Like, it is something that you have to work on. I think that once you get to the point that you are able to own these things and honor them in other people, like, once you get that confidence, I feel like that's the key. Because it to this conversation, it not only allows us to show up or to be able to at least call out when we're not being our authentic self, but it gives space for other people, as you're describing. And it's both parts. Like, I think both are important. This journey of awareness, it is equal parts the way that we're able to learn and be better in how we show up, but by each of us doing this and by the ways that we have grown and all of these stories that we've described, it gives the people around us the same opportunity to do just that.
To bring their authentic self, to be able to show up. Yeah, I like what you're saying, because I know for myself, I'm over here thinking about, part of it is, I think, my age, Gen X, and then part of it is in the messages that have been sent to Gen Xers. And then also part of it is, I think, the male female. So crying just became a bad thing, right? Crying was, to me, was a sign of weakness. But I have to realize that the messages that are sent to me, not only do I have to figure them out for myself and how I've internalized them, but I also have to figure out how they affect how I perceive a woman who cries during a meeting. Because I'll be honest, when I first got into management and I had a woman cry during a meeting, I was like, girl, I was embarrassed for her. I'm like, okay, you want to go outside? Like, to me, it was I would use words like that was unprofessional. It was weak. She's not capable. But I think, man, if that was a male that would have started crying, because she didn't she was just tearing. I'm like, I would have taken it like, oh my gosh, what's going on? Like, I wouldn't have gone to those words right away, but because it was a female, I did. So the very messages that are sent on me to put me into a box, I like what you're saying, we have to look at that and how that affects how we are perceiving others. So then we can hold back and allow that person to show up with their authentic self, because I did not create a space that would, early in my career, that allowed anyone to cry in my office. I am sure my judgment came across my face, right? Now, if someone cried, I would be able to hold it much. I'd be like, I don't know what's going on. And I wouldn't be putting on those descriptors. I'd be like, let's take a minute, let's process, and just allow that person to have that. And that's what this is about, is understanding all the messages that have been sent simply because of the identities we hold, and that we grew up in the societal system that normalizes one identity over the other. Starting to process those messages, like, how has that impacted how I live my life? you know? And the answer might be, doesn't it all, Jody? Or, oh my gosh, yeah, I've internalized that and I'm overcompensating in this area. And then also equally with that, as we're figuring out our authentic self, is like, oh, the identities I don't hold, what messages have I been sent? And how does that affect how I limit other people from finding their authentic self? I mean, unintentionally, go back to that example, I judged that woman who cried in the meeting, and I limited her. Like, she was out there now having to process, is being emotional like you are, Amy. Is it okay? I didn't make it okay for her to live out of her authentic self. So we want to also process what messages have we been sent about identities we don't hold that might affect the perception. Because the more we're aware of that, we can pull back from that and we can just hold a space. Now, what that allows us to do is build our capacity for ourselves to live out of our authentic selves, build our capacity to listen and to hold space so that others can show us truly who they are. And so that's what this episode is about. And I am so appreciative of you two actively living your journeys and sharing with us about what you feel has helped you and what you've had to process to say, hey, I'm living out of my authentic self. So capacity builders, I'm going to do Nita's piece here. You guys could have been anywhere else, but you chose to be with us, and we appreciate it. Until next time.